Many of you watching this video are probably already intimately familiar with the vital role that the RMS Carpathia played on the night that the Titanic went down. This lone ship was the only one that was able to reach the site where the Titanic sank on the night of the sinking and was ultimately responsible for rescuing all the Titanic survivors. However, for most people, this is where their knowledge of the Carpathia ends. No one really knows what happened to the Carpathia following the Titanic story. However, would you all be surprised if I was to tell you that many years after the Titanic sank, the Carpathia, even though it happened under very different circumstances than Titanic, would ultimately end up joining the Titanic at the bottom of the Atlantic? So, what I thought I would do in today's video is tell you guys the very interesting story that is the sinking of the Carpathia, and ultimately share with all of you the fate of the Titanic savior. I hope you enjoy. The story of the Carpathia's final voyage began several years after the outbreak of World War I. You see, the Carpathia, like so many other ships from this time period, was used to help out in the war effort. Primarily, the Carpathia was used to transport both American and Canadian forces across the Atlantic so they could help out with the war effort in Europe. Now, fun fact about the Carpathia. During this time period that she was transporting both American and Canadian troops, she actually ended up transporting an American soldier by the name of Frank Buckle. Why am I mentioning Frank? Well, later in life, Frank Buckle would go on to become the last living American soldier of World War I. Pretty interesting. The Carpathia's final voyage began on July the 15th, 1918. On this day, the Carpathia departed the city of Liverpool, and it was bound for Boston, Massachusetts within the United States. Now, shortly after the Carpathia left Liverpool, it met up with a bunch of other ships, and these ships formed a convoy of roughly 12 ships or so, give or take. And this convoy was going to travel together so they could try to safeguard each other against submarine attacks. Now, there was another thing that these convoys did in order to protect themselves against submarine attacks. Instead of taking a straight course away from Europe and then steaming directly towards the United States, what these ships would do instead is follow a zigzag course as they left Europe behind. And while this route was a lot slower than taking a straight shot away from Europe, it was a lot safer because it was also a lot more difficult for submarines to be able to attack vessels that were following the zigzag route. Now, the Royal Navy also provided several military vessels to accompany the Carpathia and the convoy as they steamed away from Europe. At least these military vessels would accompany the Carpathia for a little while. 2 days later, on July 17th, the military escorts left the convoy. Now, when these ships departed, roughly half of the ships that were part of the convoy left with them. And the remaining vessels, well, Carpathia was the largest ship among the vessels that were left behind. So the Carpathia assumed the role as the Commodore ship, the vessel that was in charge of the convoy, and the ships that were with the Carpathia continued to steam west towards the United States. Around 3.5 hours later, the Carpathia and the convoy were still steaming west. At this time, they were sailing through a section of the Atlantic that is also referred to as the Southwest Approaches, which is a name given to the part of the Atlantic that lies just to the southwest of Great Britain and Ireland. Now, up to this point, everything had been proceeding pretty smoothly with the crossing. However, what the Carpathia and the convoy did not know was that at this current time, a U-boat was slowly but surely approaching all the vessels. Now, the U-boat that was approaching the Carpathia's convoy was U-55, under the command by a man named Wilhelm Warner. Now, Wilhelm was doing everything he could to make sure that the convoy did not spot the U-boat approaching, and he was successful at this. Not a single ship in the convoy spotted the U-boat. Now, the thing you need to understand about U-boats during this time period is U-boat crews were under a lot of pressure to try to sink the largest ships they could. So as U-55 was approaching the convoy, Wilhelm did a quick little survey of all the ships that were sailing with it, and he quickly spotted that the Carpathia was the largest ship in the convoy. So he set his sights on sinking the RMS Carpathia and slowly but surely began his approach on the vessel. Then, at 9:15 a.m., U-55 fired a torpedo at the Carpathia. Now, the Carpathia's crew quickly noticed the approaching torpedo, and they let the captain know. The captain of the Carpathia at this time was a man by the name of William Prothero, and he had been in command of the Carpathia since 1916. The captain ordered the Carpathia's engines full speed astern, and he also ordered the ship to turn hard to starboard, but it was too late. The approaching torpedo struck the Carpathia on the port side right beside cargo hatch number 3, and the vessel began to rapidly take on water. Now, in the seconds following the torpedo detonation, before the Carpathia's crew even had a chance to respond to that, another crucial event happened to the Carpathia. U-55, mere seconds after firing the torpedo at the ship, fired a second torpedo at the Carpathia, and now it was heading directly towards the ship. The second torpedo struck the Carpathia somewhere along its midpoint. The resulting explosion penetrated the Carpathia's boiler rooms and engine room, and this explosion killed 3 firemen and 2 trimmers that were working below the Carpathia's decks. Now, when the second torpedo struck the Carpathia, it completely disabled the Carpathia's engines, meaning the vessel could not escape U-55. The explosion also seems to have caused extreme damage to the Carpathia's electrical systems, because the Marconi wireless operators on board the ship noticed that the radio went completely offline immediately following the second torpedo strike. The explosion also destroyed 2 of the Carpathia's lifeboats on the port side of the ship. However, due to the fact that the Carpathia had very few people on board during this particular voyage, the fact that 2 lifeboats were destroyed would not hinder things that much during the up-and-coming evacuation. Not long after the second torpedo strike, the Carpathia began to go down by the head, and the vessel was also slowly but surely taking on a list to port. Now, upon realizing the dire situation that his vessel was in, Captain Portherow went to the Carpathia's wireless room to tell the wireless operators to send out a call for help. Upon doing this, he realized that the ship's radio was completely offline. So, since he couldn't use this system to call for help, he then used another means to try to let all the other ships in the area know the dire situation that the Carpathia was in. So what the captain and crew of the Carpathia had to do to let all the other ships know that the Carpathia was in trouble was convey this information by use of signal flags. By using the signal flags, they let the other ships in the convoy know quite a few things. Number 1, they told them that there was a U-boat in the area and that the Carpathia had indeed been struck by a torpedo. They also told the other ships in the convoy to send out a distress call using their wireless systems, since the Carpathia could not. Now, once the other ships picked up the information and did what the Carpathia said, those ships had no choice but to try to flee away from the U-boat. These ships had no way to fight against the U-boat that was now attacking the Carpathia. If they tried to get involved, most likely these ships would be sunk. So, with nothing that those ships could do, the other ships in the convoy decided to steam away from the area as quickly as possible. The Carpathia was now completely alone. Now, what the captain of the Carpathia did, once all of this was complete, he then started sending off distress rockets to try to get the attention of any patrol boats that were in the area. Now, surprisingly, despite the massive amount of damage the Carpathia received by both the torpedoes, the vessel seemed to be going down rather slowly. So what the captain decided to do now was take advantage of this time he got to make sure that every single person that was on board the Carpathia got off the ship safely. Now, over the course of the next hour or so, with the Carpathia still slowly sinking by the head, 11 lifeboats in total were successfully launched from the Carpathia. Occupying all of these lifeboats were every single person that was on board the ship, with the exception of the 5 men that were killed in the torpedo blast, and the captain and some members of his senior crew. They stayed on board the Carpathia while the evacuation was carried out, to see to it that every crucial piece of information and documentation that was on board the ship was thrown overboard, so it could not later fall into the hands of the enemy. Now, once the captain and his crew that stayed with him successfully threw all the confidential information overboard, the men then walked out onto the Carpathia's deck and then signaled for a lifeboat that was still in the area to come alongside the Carpathia and pick them up and take them off the ship. Now, even though at this point in the sinking, the Carpathia was down pretty far at the head, the ship was still sinking slowly enough that a rescue attempt from one of these lifeboats really wouldn't pose a risk to the boat or anybody in it. This lifeboat successfully pulled up alongside the Carpathia, and the captain and his crew successfully disembarked the ship. However, while they were in the process of pulling away from the Carpathia, U-55 suddenly showed itself once again and began to slowly but surely approach the Carpathia. It seems like that Wilhelm Werner was beginning to grow impatient with the rate at which the Carpathia was sinking. He may even have feared that the vessel wouldn't founder at the rate that she was going down. So what he decided to do was have U-55 fire a third torpedo at the Carpathia. The third torpedo struck the Carpathia on the port side, more towards the front, more specifically somewhere in the area of the Carpathia's gunner room. The resulting explosion sealed the fate of Carpathia. After the third torpedo hit, the Carpathia began to drop like a rock. She went down by the head, very similar to what the Titanic did. However, unlike what the Titanic did, at the time that the final plunge of the Carpathia was beginning, thanks to the quick actions of the Carpathia's captain and crew, there wasn't a single living soul on board the Carpathia during the ship's final moments. At this point in time, all of the Carpathia survivors could do nothing except sit back and watch in their lifeboats as the sea, slowly but surely, consumed the RMS Carpathia. As the Carpathia continued to founder, it was around this time that U-55 surfaced and began to make its way towards the Carpathia's lifeboats. It was also around this time that this really famous photograph of the Carpathia sinking was taken. Yes, you heard me right, this is a real photograph of the Carpathia during her final moments. Now, I'm not 100% certain about this, but I believe this photo was taken from U-55 after it surfaced. If I'm wrong about that, please correct me in the comments below. Now, we don't know for certain what the intentions of U-55 were as it was approaching the Carpathia's lifeboats, but it's entirely possible that the crew of U-55 was intending to rob or maybe even gun down the Carpathia survivors using the submarine's deck gun. However, luckily, before we could find out what would happen, a warship known as the HMS Snowdrop arrived on the scene and began to open fire on U-55. The submarine quickly fled the area, and then once this happened, the Snowdrop then proceeded to rescue all of the Carpathia survivors. Then, roughly 1 hour and 45 minutes after the first torpedo detonation, the RMS Carpathia slowly slipped beneath the surface, signaling the end of the once great ocean liner that rescued all of the Titanic survivors many years before. Immediately following the sinking of the RMS Carpathia, the HMS Snowdrop was successful in picking up each of the ship's lifeboats, and they brought all the survivors on board. All in all, the Snowdrop brought 218 out of the ship's 223 occupants on board the ship. The only exception to this being the 5 men that were killed when the second torpedo struck the Carpathia. Now guys, it is a tragedy that those 5 men lost their lives. However, we are fortunate that the loss of life on board the Carpathia was not a lot worse. The only reason this was the case was thanks to the incredible work by the ship's captain and crew, who made it their mission to make sure that every single person that was on board the Carpathia got off the ship before she went down. And guys, this concludes the story of the sinking of the RMS Carpathia. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave it a like, and if you're new here, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys so much, it really helps out a lot, and I will see you guys in the next official Historic Travels video. Y'all have a good one. Special thanks to David McGee and the Blue Star Line for providing the animations for this video. This video wouldn't have been possible without you. Thanks again. Special thanks to our Captain level Patreon supporters, Tammy Lee and Bodie McBoatface. Thank you so much for all the support.